This week, 2 new books about the perilous nature of the current work economy. First up, Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn talk about their new book, Tightrope, with my colleague Jennifer Salai. This took place at a live book review event last week. For those who missed it, we've got some highlights. Then, what do we do about the robots taking over our jobs? Daniel Susskind will be here to talk about his book, World Without Work. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, our critics will join us for the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. On January 14th, in the first of a year-long series of book review live events, my colleague Jennifer Salai, a critic here at the New York Times, interviewed Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn about their new book, Tightrope. The following is a little bit of an excerpt from that event and that conversation.
I wanted to start off by talking about the genesis of this book project, which it's really interesting for a variety of reasons, but one of the things that struck me was that this is your 5th book together, and your other books have taken you across the world. You've looked at poverty initiatives in Kenya, you've looked at education for girls in China, and this is something that's much closer to home. I mean, it literally is home for you, Nick. So can you tell us a bit about how you decided to write about Yamhill?
Well, it's partly exactly that. We were traveling around the world covering humanitarian crises, and then we would go back to my beloved hometown of Yamhill, where my mom still lives on the family farm, and we saw a humanitarian crisis unfolding there. And, my old school bus is kind of a network of old friends, and, we realized that about a quarter of the kids on that bus had passed away from consequences of drugs, alcohol, suicide, reckless accidents, and related pathologies. And that this wasn't just one town's problem, this was a nation's problem. And that there is something of a great social depression happening across the country. Even in the Great Depression, life expectancy didn't fall the way it does now. It's fallen 3 years in a row in the US. And it seemed to us that this wasn't getting adequate attention, that we could write about it and to some degree use this town that I care very deeply about as a narrative thread to tell that story.
Nick and Sheryl, I think I want to talk about the themes in this book and the subject of this book and the issues and the questions that it raises, because those are really important, they're really urgent, and I think it's something that everybody needs to think about and confront. But I did want to have a bit of a process question, because I think there's a number of people I know, maybe myself included, who, the idea of writing a book with one spouse seems maybe complicated. And so this is your 5th book together, and I just wanted to know a little bit about how that works, the division of labor, what happens when you disagree about something.
Well, so I write the subjects and he writes the verbs. And so we each write half a book. But the nice thing is that you only have to write half a book. And somehow it magically appears to be a whole book. But we do have very similar views. I have a slightly more sort of, economic business take, and he has a slightly more sort of political socioeconomic take. So it's actually very complementary. And we do discuss things a lot. The treatment of certain topics we really do discuss. We each write sections. We don't necessarily know what's going to be a full chapter in the very beginning, and then we mix and match, and then our editor, speaks up, and then, this chapter 2 goes to chapter 16, and 16 goes to chapter 4, and, there's a lot of mixing and matching and moving around. And when editing, of course.
The voice of the book is very much a unified voice. I mean, do you end up going over each other's chapters just to make sure?
Oh, yeah, no, we constantly totally edit each other. I mean, and, that's because I'm a former reporter, but, we're both sort of have journalistic experience, and so we're just used to being edited.
Fair.
That's why we're still married.
So one of the things that I noticed in the book from the get-go is that you start off with some really arresting analogies. So you make mention of Dante's Inferno. You call the situation in America today 20th century feudalism. I think, and I think for a number of Americans, those are really striking, maybe startling analogies. And I was wondering, what did you mean when you decided to use those words?
So we talked a lot about that because they are very striking images. And we used to think that when we were traveling around the world, visiting some of the places, both in China and other parts of the developing world, that the poverty and the pain and the suffering that we saw there overseas was of a dimension that was just, far greater than anything that one could see here in America. And then when we started learning more about what was going on in our own backyard, we started learning a lot more about the pain and suffering that people were feeling here. And it really is about the human condition. And it's about just the catharsis sometimes, but also the intense, searing depression that people feel. And so it really is very comparable. It was surprising to us and shocking to us. And if you look back at what is happening in many towns across America, it is an inferno for these people and for these families.
I mean, we were really searching for metaphors to kind of grab people by the lapel. And I offered the metaphor a moment ago of a great social depression. At least in the Great Depression, there was an enormous effort through government policy to address it and mitigate it. And it feels as if now there is this horrendous suffering out there, and there isn't a similar government effort to address it. And indeed, that suffering isn't all that even noticed by those who are doing better. That, in the first class deck, there's a great party going on, and meanwhile, the ship of state is kind of capsizing in ways that obviously affect those below decks, but ultimately affect our whole country. And we were searching for ways to convey that urgency, and that's what we hope Tightrope will do, to try to broaden the conversation from just Trump's tweets of the day to this larger convulsion that the country is enduring.
Part of the country is feeling something far worse than the Great Depression, because what is driving that decline in life expectancy is deaths of despair. It's basically the deaths that have been well documented by Angus Deaton and Ann Case very eloquently in their research that shows that these deaths are basically three types: alcohol-related deaths, deaths from overdose related to drugs, and suicides. We're at the highest rate of suicides in this country since World War II. These are stunning, statistics, and somehow or other, they're not yet, rising to the surface.
As you mentioned, these deaths of despair, they're enormous tragedies. They touch on such fundamental wounds, essentially. And I was wondering, when it came to reporting this book, were people eager to talk to you, reluctant to talk to you? Was it a mix of both? Because this is opening up some really serious questions about, family history, all of this stuff.
It was hard to report. It's hard to talk about now. We benefited in many ways in that, in Yamhill, we had old friends with whom we remained close, who were willing to talk to us very bluntly and about their own struggles. And dear friend of mine from the seventh grade on, Mary Mayer, incredibly talented young woman, and she was deeply embarrassed that she'd been homeless for 7 years, and she tried to keep people from knowing it. But we talked about it, and she was willing to tell her story, because she said that when she had been homeless, that people just looked through her. They didn't recognize her. They didn't see her as a human being. And she thought that maybe if she told her story, that maybe readers would understand what happens when people are enduring that and would see the next homeless person through a somewhat more humane and compassionate lens. And so she was willing to share something that she was deeply embarrassed about. And, we are so grateful for their honesty and courage in doing so.
Another thing that is brought up in the book, in addition to education, which is one of the big things, but also healthcare. What has changed, since the time that we're talking about? Healthcare has become an enormous part of people's budgets, even if they have insurance.
So in the 1960s, for example, we were about in the mid-range of OECD countries in terms of health outcomes. Now we are, and pretty much every other country since then has adopted some kind of universal care system. In some cases it's single payer, sometimes it's multi-payer, but some kind of universal system. And the US is almost alone in not doing so. And the upshot is that we have healthcare outcomes roughly similar to those of Ecuador. American children are 55% more likely to die than those in other OECD countries. We visited health fairs where I saw one man who hadn't been to a dentist in 20 years because of a lack of dental care. He had 18 teeth pulled simultaneously because he hadn't had access to a dentist. His teeth were all rotten. 18 teeth pulled. This was from a health aid group that started out to help countries in the developing world, and it happened to be based in Tennessee, and then they got a phone call from a town an hour away in Tennessee to say, can you help us here? Can you send over a dentist and a doctor? And so since then, they've been operating these health fairs here in the US because they find the needs equally urgent. Shannon County in South Dakota has a shorter life expectancy than Cambodia or Bangladesh. That should be a scandal. A country can't live up to its potential if its people don't.
One of the things that I noticed in this book, and you've done this in your previous books as well, which is really appeal to people's moral conscience and show why these stories, what's happening right now, is a moral crisis. But I also notice, and this is something that I thought was also very interesting, is that there's the suggestion that it is a moral question, but that also from the perspective of self-interest, maybe, that Americans should be thinking about these issues. And I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about that.
We were overwhelmed by the manifest injustice that is going on out there. We wrote about a woman who was addicted to heroin, paid for it by carrying some, and even though she has a pure history of nonviolent offenses, she was sentenced in Alabama to 999 years in prison. 999 years. And meanwhile, the Sackler family has $13 billion from causing infinitely more addiction. And, what is that but just unconscionable? So for those who care deeply about justice, we will make that argument. But we would also note that the war on drugs and mass incarceration has been a dismal failure and is just ineffective. And whether you look at it from justice and efficiency or from costs, from any metric, it seems to me we've been often taking the exact wrong path.
I think the strongest argument is the competitive argument. I think that really, if we want to remain competitive, America is great at innovation, and we want to remain great at innovation, but China really is going to get extremely good at innovation. People used to say, they're just copycats. They said it about Taiwan. They said it about Japan. There's a huge amount of innovation in these countries. And, I do think that unless we can really make sure that every American is operating at its full capacity as possible, all pistons charging, I think that we're just not going to remain number one. And I think that that's a very strong argument that is bipartisan. I just think that, it appeals to Republicans and Democrats, and I think that that's a way that we can actually bridge the gap so that we can work together and try and improve the society.
We've been talking about a lot of grim things today, and we want to be clear that it's not hopeless and that there are toolboxes that can help solve these problems. The U.S. managed to reduce teen pregnancy by 61% since the modern peak in 1991. And, that's confronting hormones and a million other things, and yet, by using evidence-based policies, we were able to achieve that. Homelessness is about as difficult, obdurate a challenge as one can think of. Yet, because the U.S. decided that veteran homelessness was intolerable, so the Obama administration took it on, and we reduced veteran homelessness by about half. Well, on the streets tonight, there will be about 100,000 kids who are homeless tonight in America. If we found child homelessness to be similarly intolerable, we wouldn't be able to reduce that 100%. We could reduce that by half using the same strategies we took to reduce veteran homelessness. So the problem is not the tools we have or the strategies. The problem is our political will and our willingness to notice and confront these issues. If we notice them, if we will generate the will to address them, we can solve these.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick, Sheryl. Thank you for coming.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Daniel Susskind joins us now from London. His new book is called A World Without Work, Technology, Automation, and How We Should Respond. Daniel, thanks so much for being here.
Real pleasure to be with you.
I want to talk about your first book for a minute, which was called The Future of the Professions. And I feel like, is this like the next logical step, that there are no professions? But what was that book about? And does this book have a kind of different take from that one?
That book was looking at how technology affects white-collar workers, so lawyers and doctors, teachers and accountants, architects and consultants. So it was, in a sense, narrower in scope than this book. This book is looking not just at white-collar workers, but at how technology is affecting all types of work and how it will affect how we live together as well. It's a broader book.
We have long worried as workers, employers, and employees that the robots are going to come and take away our jobs. Now, historically, that has not been the case. But if you could just go back in time, when did we start fearing this? Was this an Industrial Revolution era fear, or did it start even earlier? When did this happen?
Ever since modern economic growth began several centuries ago, people have worried about new technologies taking their jobs. Today, there's a sort of frenzy of writing and reports and reviews on the future of work. But a lot of these worries, a lot of this automation anxiety has been with us, exactly as you say, since modern economic growth began with the Industrial Revolution in Britain.
Give some examples, because people were afraid of things like the spinning jenny, right?
Yes, exactly. The British government had to pass an act in 1812 called the Destruction of Stocking Frames, etc. Act, which made the destruction of stocking frames a crime punishable by death. So I think the following year, several people were in fact tried and executed. People have worried about these technologies, and the disturbances that have been stirred up in response to these technologies have been really quite substantial since the Industrial Revolution.
How did that all work out in the end?
Well, of course, the important observation to make is that all these worries about automation anxiety, about technology taking people's jobs, have generally turned out to be wrong. By and large, despite really quite significant technological upheavals, there's always been enough work for people to do. And that's the starting point of my new book, which is, how can it be that people have worried so much in the past and turned out to be wrong? And why is it that this time is different?
They were not entirely wrong, though, right? Because people did lose their jobs. It's just that other different kinds of jobs were created at the same time. Isn't that correct? I mean, there were jobs that became automated and no longer existed, but that the technological innovation at the same time generated new forms of employment.
That's right. And I think one of the unhelpful things that we do as well is that we tend to talk about the different jobs that people do. So we talk about journalists and lawyers and doctors and teachers and accountants. And actually the term jobs is quite unhelpful for thinking about how technology affects work, because technology doesn't just affect the number of jobs, but it also affects the quality of those jobs,
Right.
the pay of the jobs, their status, their security. And what you see is not only at during sort of transitions that took place in the Industrial Revolution when people moved from certain jobs to other jobs, not only do you see the jobs themselves changing, but also all those other qualities of the jobs change as well. And one of the things I'm trying to argue in the book is that this focus on unemployment, this focus on the number of jobs alone, can sometimes give us quite a misleading insight into what technology is actually doing to the world of work.
In terms of the kinds of jobs and the remuneration and the security of those jobs.
That's right. But also think about the US labor market as well. The unemployment rate at the moment is very low. I think it's 3.6%. But your participation rate, so the proportion of the entire working age population who are in work, I think has fallen to its lowest level since 1977. More people than ever are stepping out of the US labor market altogether. And so this focus on unemployment figures alone can sometimes be quite a misleading guide into what technology is actually doing to the world of work.
Why do we focus on the unemployment figures alone, given those contrasting participation rate figures? And is that only in the U.S.? Do we have that kind of singular focus? Or in the U.K., is the focus narrowly on unemployment as well?
I think it's a general story. It's the most salient and the most easily understandable fact about the world of work. And as a result, it's what we tend to use as our barometer of the health of the working world. But it's not always as insightful as other numbers could be. I mean, another reason why focusing on jobs is sometimes misleading is because it tends to make us think of the sort of work that we all do as a sort of monolithic, indivisible lump of stuff.
Right.
Lawyers do lawyering, doctors do doctoring, teachers do teaching, and so on. And of course, that's incredibly unhelpful, because if you look under the bonnet of any job, what you see is that people perform a huge range of tasks and activities in those jobs.
As you said, in earlier instances in which people feared that technology was going to eliminate their jobs, and in fact, it didn't, you're saying now it may. What's changed?
I mean, the very short answer is that our systems and machines are just becoming relentlessly increasingly capable. They are taking on more and more tasks and activities that we thought only human beings alone could ever do. Anything from making medical diagnoses to driving cars, drafting legal documents, to composing music. That's the short answer. I mean, the longer answer is that when you look back at economic history, at the various economic forces that have tended to increase the demand for the work of human beings, the worry is that because of this relentless technological progress, those economic forces might be less strong in the future than they are today. And that's what I'm arguing in the book, that when you look at these economic forces that have tended to increase the demand for the work of human beings in the past, I think there's a legitimate worry that because of these systems and machines just taking on more and more tasks and activities, that these forces will be weaker in the future.
So in the past, we worried, but then we didn't worry too much because the technology, though extraordinarily efficient, was also kind of stupid. It was like stuff that would replace blue-collar workers or very simple tasks. Are you saying that the technology itself, is it artificial intelligence that shifted the dynamic, and that now they're taking the jobs away from the people who scoffed at all of that the last time around?
I think that's right. I mean, traditionally, both computer scientists and economists have tended to think that these systems and machines could only really perform routine tasks, the sorts of activities that human beings find easy to articulate, things that are relatively straightforward to do, relatively process-based, and so on. But conversely, they'll struggle to do non-routine tasks, things that we find hard to explain how we do them. So something like the task of making a medical diagnosis. If you sit down with a doctor and say, how is it that you make a medical diagnosis? They might be able to give you a few rules of thumb, but ultimately they'd struggle. They'd say things like, it requires intuition or judgment or instinct or experience. In short, they'd say, I can't really articulate to you exactly how it is that I make a medical diagnosis. And that was the reason people thought these tasks were so hard to automate. The human being can't articulate how it is that they perform a particular task. Where on earth do we begin in writing a set of instructions for a machine to follow? The mistake is that these computer scientists and economists tended to think that these systems and machines had to copy the way that human beings thought and reasoned in order to outperform them. So to make a medical diagnosis, you had to copy the way that a human doctor made that diagnosis. But what we've seen, if you take, for instance, a system developed at Stanford that can tell you whether or not a freckle is cancerous as accurately as leading dermatologists, it's not trying to copy the way that a human doctor makes a medical diagnosis. It understands nothing about medicine at all. It's got a vast database, I think, of about 129,500 past cases, and it's running what's essentially a pattern recognition algorithm through those cases, hunting for similarities between them and the particular photo of the troubling lesion in question. It's performing this task in an unhuman way, based on the analysis of more possible cases than any human doctor could hope to review in their lifetime. It no longer matters that if you were to sit down with a doctor and say, tell me about how it is you do what you do, they struggle to articulate themselves. And this is true for so many of these non-routine tasks that require creativity or judgment or even things like empathy. As human beings, we struggle to articulate how it is we do these things, but that's no longer a bottleneck on automation. We're now able to design systems and machines that operate in fundamentally different ways to us. And a whole new realm of tasks that we once thought were out of reach of machines are increasingly within reach.
Okay. I might be all right with the doctor-lawyer thing, but when you talk about creative jobs, then as a writer and editor, I start to feel a little defensive and nervous. I know that there are systems that, predictive writing that you see obviously now in many email systems, things can be written by machines. However, can art be created by a machine? I mean, can they come up with voice and style and something individual when there is no individual in this robot world?
The example that jumps to mind is the new concert hall in Hamburg, where if you go in, it's an incredibly beautiful building. And if you see photos of it,
yes,
you think, only a human being with a remarkably refined aesthetic sensibility would be able to sort of craft a space like this. Only it wasn't designed by a human being. It was designed by an algorithm. And the designers or the architects set this algorithm a relatively sparse set of design criteria. We wanted to have these acoustic properties. We want it to be made of these materials. And the system generated a set of possible designs, and all that was left for the architects was to leaf through them and choose the one they liked the most. The observation I make about that, though, is that would we call that machine creative? And I probably agree with you that it's the wrong word. It's performing a task that might require creativity from a human being, namely designing an aesthetically impressive building. But it's doing it in a fundamentally different way to us. I wouldn't call it creative, but it's solving the sort of problem that we use creativity to solve. Similarly, a system that predicts the outcome of patent disputes as accurately as leading patent lawyers, it's not exercising judgment like a lawyer might, relying upon legal reasoning. It's doing it in a fundamentally different way, using lots of past cases and things like the nature of the case, the time and place, to make a statistical prediction. And this is what we're seeing more and more of, I think.
For employers in the past, having things become automated has been kind of good news, right? Because they don't have to pay these robots. Robots and machinery cannot organize. They cannot strike. Is there a downside for employers, or is this all good news for them?
I think one of the great challenges about many of these systems and machines is that because they work in very different ways to human beings, they're incredibly opaque. It's very hard to understand often how these systems and machines work. And if you are given a particular diagnosis by a diagnostic system, you will want to know, why the system reached a particular decision. Why did it say that this particular freckle was cancerous or not? Mm-hmm. In the past, 20, 30 years ago, when systems were built on human reasoning, it was very easy to understand how these systems and machines worked. You could just follow the steps that they were following. But now these systems and machines, using lots of data, processing power, and advances in algorithm design, are far more opaque. They're far less transparent. And I think one of the challenges of using these systems is that opacity. And I think, whether it's a system being used to diagnose an illness, or a system being used to make lending decisions, or a system being used to inform parole decisions, there is going to be an increasing demand for these systems to be as transparent as the human beings that would have replaced them, even if they're more effective or more efficient or more productive.
All right, here's another transparency-related question,
Sure.
Which is that technological advances have often brought about prosperity, lowering costs for companies, giving them greater profits, perhaps leading employees to retrain for better paying jobs. In this case, you make an argument that the prosperity might not be as widely dispersed as it was in past circumstances. Why is that? Who loses?
I mean, it's worth saying that I'm not arguing in the book that I think there's going to be some dramatic technological big bang in the next few years, after which large numbers of people wake up and find themselves without work. What I do think that's going to happen is that as we move through the 21st century, more and more people will find themselves unable to make the sorts of economic contributions that they might have hoped to make in the 20th century. And the economic problem here fundamentally is a distribution problem. The traditional way in which we share out material prosperity in society is through the labor market. That's the way, for most people, their job is their only source of income. And so the challenge in a world with less work, not a world without any work, but just a world with less work, is how we share out prosperity in society when our traditional way of doing so, paying people for the work that they do, is less effective than in the past. And I think the challenge of a world with less work is fundamentally a challenge of inequality. It's a distributional challenge of how we share out prosperity.
So if you had a kid right now who was heading off to college in the next 5 or 10 years, as a parent and an economist, knowing what you know, is there advice that you would give her about, you might want to steer clear of this kind of thing and perhaps look at that?
I do, in fact. I have a 22-month-old daughter, so I'm not yet anxious about the future of her career. But if she were a bit older, what advice would I give her? I mean, very crudely, I think there are two strategies for the 2020s, for the next 10 years. Either you try and become the sort of person who can build these systems and machines, or you try and become the sort of person who can compete with these systems and machines, do the sorts of things that these systems and machines cannot do. Those, to me, seem to be the two strategies. I think the challenge is that when you look at educational systems around the world, not only, and this is what I argue in the book, not only are we doing neither of those things particularly effectively, not only are we not teaching people to either design these systems or machines or compete with these systems or machines, but in fact we're doing precisely the opposite. We're teaching people to do precisely the sorts of things that these systems and machines are good at doing. I spend quite a lot of my time teaching maths and economics at Oxford, and I know that out there are systems like some basic apps like Socratic and Photo Math, where if you go to a textbook, in a secondary school, and take a photo of the maths problems in those textbooks with one of these apps will take the photo, process it, identify the problem, and give you an answer. They'll do it if you handwrite the problem as well. And it troubles me that, we're still teaching so much of our maths in such a way that even the most basic, simple, off-the-shelf systems can handle it with relative ease. We ought to be teaching this material in such a way that these systems and machines cannot do. And it's true not just in math, but across all disciplines and all fields.
Well, Daniel, when you come back for this podcast after your next book comes out, I'm sure it will be hosted by Siri or Alexa.
Yeah, well, I'm not, in fact, Daniel. I'm a robot sitting at the other end in London.
That's right. Well, right. Let's all come clear now. Daniel, thank you so much for being here.
Not at all. Thank you very much for having me.
If, in fact, you were. Daniel Susskind is the author of A World Without Work, Technology, Automation, and How We Should Respond. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
What's new?
So we're still getting a clearer picture of how the industry was faring in 2019, and it wasn't that great. It wasn't terrible, but NPD BookScan just released its numbers about print sales in 2019, and they did fall, as everyone suspected, in 2019 by 1.3% compared to 2018.
That's not terrible.
It's not terrible. So it's essentially maintaining sales more or less. And of course, audiobooks are still growing. Ebooks are still falling, but audiobooks are growing quite a bit, and they're not really cannibalizing print. So everything's pretty stable, but what was sort of interesting was what that was attributed to. And so a lot of people are pointing to a slight dip in nonfiction sales. As we talked about recently, there were a huge number of successful political books in 2018. Michelle Obama's being the biggest example of that. There's an interesting article in Publishers Weekly, which is sort of breaking out some of these numbers from NPD BookScan, looking at different segments within the category. So within the history, law, politics segment, those sales fell almost 10% in 2019. So that sort of dragged down the whole category. And adult fiction sales fell again in 2019 by almost 5%, and that's a trend that's been continuing for a couple of years. One category that did grow was horror occult psychology, where units increased by more than 16%. Make of that what you will. I guess there's a growing horror or an interest in horror as well as the occult.
People are horrified.
People are horrified.
They want witches to explain it all.
Exactly.
There are a lot of good books coming out this year, at least from what I'm seeing in the catalogs and hearing from publishers. But I do feel like I want to set my hopes on 2021.
Another thing to consider that could drive sales in a major way is there are a lot of big adaptations of books coming out this year in 2020, including the TV show based on The Outsider by Stephen King. Not that he necessarily needs a lot of help. There's Jenny Han's P.S. I Love You. It's going to be a movie. Joan Didion's The Last Thing He Wanted is coming out. Call of the Wild. All the Right Places by Jennifer Niven.
Little Fires Everywhere, right? On TV?
Yes, Little Fires Everywhere. The Plot Against America. Secret Garden. So, whenever you have a good adaptation or frankly even a not good adaptation, the sales can really jump. It's remarkable.
Let's see what The Turning does for Henry James.
Yes.
All right. Alexandra, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Our critics join us now. We have Parl Sagal, Jen Salai, and Dwight Garner. Hey, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
All right. Let's talk about what you have recently read and reviewed for us. And Parl, why don't you start?
Sure. I reviewed James Wood's new collection called Serious Noticing, which gathers about 30 years of his criticism and essays. And Wood is a critic that's important to me. I'm always interested in reading. And just to get a sense of the breadth of his work over these years and to see a critic change, to see the kinds of things he wants to write about change, his tone changes. It's a really, I just found it incredibly exciting, especially because it really pushes against some of the popular perceptions of James Wood, who's so influential in sort of championing a certain brand of realism, has a very strict idea of what fiction can and should do, and sometimes gets pegged as being narrow or as being a little doctrinaire. And to read these reviews over the years is just to say he's one of the more unusual critics we've ever had.
All right, let's pull back a second. So
Yes.
he's writing now for The New Yorker.
He's writing for The New Yorker. He originally started at The Guardian and made his name writing these very slashing, negative, swashbuckling reviews, came over to The New Republic, and now has been at The New Yorker for about 13 years. And still, writes for the LRBs, also writes these personal pieces about his childhood. He wrote a great piece about Brexit, but he's known for sort of, especially in the last decade or so, these reviews of kind of classic writers, Chekhov, and rereading them, as well as, he's been very instrumental in the rise of Ben Lerner and Ferrante and championing a certain kind of autofiction.
I saw him on a panel about criticism, I want to say, I think it was in 2005. And he was on a panel with Alessandra Stanley, who was then a TV critic for the Times, and Wesley Morris, who was then at the Boston Globe, and now, of course, is here at the Times. And Wood had recently published a novel and was asked, how did that change your own criticism? And he said, I don't have it in me anymore to be cruel. Did that hold, or did he get cruel again?
No, yeah. And I read in the review that it's really interesting to see this person who made his name writing some really spectacular negative reviews that are very fun to read. It's not that just that he's mellowed. He definitely has. And he also talks about it's a function of age. It's a function of becoming a novelist himself. It's also a function that if you're a critic who really likes fighting, you just end up fighting the same fight. It gets dull.
What is his fight?
His major fight, I think, is when he sees fiction evading its responsibilities to reality, to representing reality and saying, this is what consciousness feels like. This is what the world actually is. That is my very brief sort of summation of what I think his essential fight is. Also to see language improperly used drives him crazy, but that's most critics. So he has mellowed, but I think it's more that when you read these reviews, you also get to see a new register. There's a new certain kind of lightness in his touch, an ability to just wonder at language instead of marshaling it into thesis all the time. You know, Wood is somebody who, when, especially at the early part of his career, when he liked something, he had to almost derive a law for it. You know, pleasure had to be interrogated. Pleasure had to be made a good. There had to be a moral function. And I think that some of that still exists in him, but there is a lot more just bliss on the page. There's much more a sense of just the aesthetic being its own end. And
how would you say you differ from him as a critic?
It's really hard. I think a lot of us who really care about fiction and write reviews, and I read this in the review, we learn to read from Wood, you know? And he's shaped so much of the popular sense of how do we know a character is believable? How do we know a detail is telling? Or why do we think fiction moves us? A lot of these things flow from his work. I think for me, the way I differ is that I never like to make laws out of my observations and impressions. I think I'm comfortable saying this is what I think and what I feel and expressing that in the body of the review, but not necessarily being so interested in fiction should be this and that. For me, the whole beauty of fiction is that it's constantly mutating, that I don't know what it is. And I don't really know the difference. I spent about hours and hours last week trying to decide what the difference was between a short story and a novel. None of these things are fixed for me, I think. And that is, I think, the big difference.
Dwight, you recently wrote about two recently deceased major critics of the 21st and 20th century, Harold Bloom and Clive James. Where would you say James Wood kind of fits in?
Well, he's closer to Bloom, I would say. I mean, Clive James, was a polymath and a great critic in so many genres. I mean, a great poetry critic and a great critic of fiction. But Clive also did, television and TV criticism and film and all sorts of things. And Clive was witty, and it's not to say that James Wood cannot be charming, because he can be, but he didn't go for the killer joke the way Clive did. He's closer to Bloom. Bloom was more of a brooder, I think, than James Wood. I've been a terrific fan of Wood since the start. Matter of fact, we were on a panel in Oslo together a few years ago. We had an interesting debate. We're talking what Liz Parle was talking about, his disinclination now to write negative reviews. And one of the points he made on stage was that very few negative reviews survive in the culture. He thinks that critical works that stand the test of time generally are analyses and not takedowns. And I agreed with him, although I remember I did say that I think a critic who writes for posterity is probably not always functioning as a good critic. I think as a critic, you have to write for today, and you hope that your stuff will stand the test of time. And I think if you're thinking about posterity, you're probably losing in some way.
I want to rewind just a second to that panel in Oslo, because I don't know, I feel like that sounds like a very nice thing to do, to sit on a panel in Oslo talking about criticism. What was that?
It wasn't bad. It was a book festival, and he was invited. I was invited, and a few other people. And yeah, it was sort of a nice boondoggle, a chance to eat reindeer burgers.
Did you?
Really?
I did eat a reindeer burger.
Well, there's my segue to, no, actually, I want to segue to your next.
Deft.
I want to segue to the book that you reviewed, actually, based on something that Parle said earlier, which was pondering about the difference between the short story and the novel, because the book that you reviewed is, in some reviews, written as a novel. I believe it was published as a novel, but some are saying this is a collection of stories or interconnected short stories. So tell us about that book and your opinion on that matter.
Well, the book is Garth Greenwell's new book, Cleanness. And Greenwell is sort of the flavor of the moment. He's sort of everywhere and being profiled in the Times. And I've written about him. And I think the book review is covering him as well soon. But, he deserves the attention, in my view. I mean, he's got this thing. And it's this thing that only comes around, from my perspective, once in a while, where he just has this voice that grabs you. It's like hearing, Ben Webster's saxophone or Charlie Hayden's bass or Tom York's voice. You sort of cock your head and go, that is a sound that I want to listen to. And so it catches you first, just because you can just write. And then And then slowly you sort of absorbed into what he's talking about. And what he's talking about 9 times out of 10 is sex. He writes about gay sex in a scorching manner, in a deep manner, in a way that I compare to the sex in Milan Kundera's novels, in the sense that there are important scenes in both of their work. I mean, the novels kind of hinge on them, and the characters' personalities kind of play out and are revealed in these scenes. Anyway, I think he's extraordinary talent. I think having this kind of voice, it'll be interesting to see where he goes with it, because he's written 2 novels now. The first was called What Belongs to You, and Now Cleanness. And they're very similar. I mean, they're both set in Bulgaria. They both have this teacher who's sort of picking up rough trade and also sleeping with younger men. And they're very similar. As to your question about short story versus novel, yes. I mean, this book is told as a series of discrete sections that would work as short stories, but it does feel like a novel to me.
One thing I've heard from editors is that though fiction writers love writing short stories, readers don't necessarily want to read them, or they at least don't buy many books of short story collections. And so certain books that might have been originally intended as short stories end up being published as novels. And knowing that, I wonder, do you look at books kind of thinking to yourself, this is really a collection of short stories on occasion, or does that distinction occur to you?
Well, you can always tell. I think, I mean, some books are billed as novels, and you pick them up and you start reading it, and you can tell it just doesn't hang together. And it's hard to be angry at a writer for that. I mean, you can't really hold them to account. It's probably their publisher who forced them to do it. So I would never think about penalizing a writer for that. The book works or it doesn't. But other times, I mean, in the case of Greenwell and this novel Cleanness, I'm calling it a novel, it just holds together like a novel.
And Jen, what did you review this week?
I reviewed, actually this was last week in the paper, a book called Franchise by a historian at Georgetown named Marcia Chatelain. And it's a history of fast food in America, more specifically fast food and Black communities in America. And even more specific than that, she really focuses on McDonald's. And what she traces is this transformation from the fast food industry as something that started as this business in 1940s and 1950s America, really serving, this affluent post-war boom community. And for the most part at the time, those were mainly white people who lived in the suburbs. How that transformed, especially during the civil rights movement, into an industry that now is predominantly associated with cities and, as she says, with Black communities. And so what she looks at is how, the civil rights movement, wanted to open up this business that was previously exclusionary. So
meaning exclusionary to patrons or to franchise owners?
Exactly. So initially it started out, after the sit-ins at Woolworths, there was this notion that businesses that were owned by white franchise owners that predominantly employed white people, that in the South abided by the Jim Crow rules having to do with segregation, that what McDonald's needed to do was open up its hiring practices and employ people of the community as well, and also end segregation in terms of how they serve patrons. So that was the first part of it. But then what happened, she says, especially after the assassination of Martin Luther King and the uprisings in the cities, was that communities started to advocate for the McDonald's in their neighborhoods to be owned by Black entrepreneurs. And that wasn't the case before 1968. So she traces this history where she shows that McDonald's made this concerted effort to find Black franchise owners to own the restaurants in their communities. What she also shows is that the consequences of this have been actually quite complicated. And I think at the time there was this notion and there was this movement of Black capitalism to basically open up the modes of production to Black entrepreneurs. And the notion was that the benefits of this would trickle down to the communities. And as she shows, on the one hand, that was the case. I mean, it was the case that Black philanthropists with money that they made from their stores were able to have a youth job program, were able to sponsor things in the community, were able to give money that was really needed and well used by these communities. But at the same time, in terms of the transformative effect that I think people wanted, that wasn't necessarily the case. She also does touch on the public health issues having to do with the consumption of fast food and what that means I mean, she really traces this history that was completely fascinating to me. And she's really good at pointing out this mixed legacy, because I think it's not entirely this story of exploitation on the one hand, and it's also not entirely the story of, this magnanimous corporation opening itself up. On the other hand, what she says is that actually it's been incredibly complicated, and she's really quite sympathetic, I think, to all sides involved in this.
I'm curious about the more contemporary aspect of it. The history is totally fascinating, but given the fact that in many cities, in areas that are largely people of color, you have fast food restaurant after fast food restaurant after fast food restaurant, and given the quality of the food that's often used in these restaurants, these communities feel sort of targeted by these corporations and kind of hooked into this cycle of high fat, high sugar, high salt, really unhealthy food, and the levels of obesity and diabetes, et cetera.
Right. So she talks a little bit about that. I mean, her book is mainly, okay, how did we get here? Mm-hmm. And so the history is really what she focuses on. And there's this emphasis on individual choice, that it all has to do with healthy choices. And, if you teach people, okay, well, you should be eating fewer hamburgers and you should be eating more fresh vegetables. She says, there's also this larger structural history that we also need to pay attention to, which is how did we get here? And also, fast food was an industry that was really supported by a lot of federal subsidies, essentially, in terms of government loans. I mean, right after the war, there was a GI Bill, which helped a lot of, at least white veterans own these businesses. But then, even after that, there was this notion of, okay, well, if we help entrepreneurs buy these stores, own these franchises, then they will figure out how to employ their community. They will figure out how to do this stuff. Also, she points out, fast food was an industry that at the time when all these federal loans were available, it was the kind of business that was structured in such a way that people could take advantage of it. So it made sense that, during the civil rights movement, that this was a business that started to flourish. And she doesn't want to deny, I think, the very real benefits that these restaurants have offered their communities. I mean, yes, there is the looming very big issue having to do with the actual food itself and how it's engineered by the corporation to really be addictive.
But the autonomy, but the ability to sort of even have community
exactly. And it's a really interesting question about Black capitalism in general, and this is just one facet of it, which is, as she also says, during the 1960s, Black communities were used to being completely underserved by governments. So it made sense that some people in the communities would think, okay, well, maybe the marketplace is a way that we can have some autonomy. We can do what we need to do for the people in our neighborhood.
It's interesting. There have been a number of books recently, and there are a couple upcoming that look at, I want to say sort of broadly speaking, African Americans and food, travel, leisure. Like there was one about bellhops in Grand Central that came out earlier last fall. There are a couple upcoming, one about African Americans in travel in this country, another one about Green Book specifically. And I don't know why this is, or suddenly there are all these books.
It is interesting to look at that particular era when things maybe seemed like they were starting to open up and there were more possibilities, but then looking at, in terms of fast food at least, this very mixed, complicated consequences of that. And I think she's really, really good at, telling the story very clearly, also talking about her own relationship to McDonald's, which is, she says it's a place that she's eaten at for most of her life and she's really enjoyed it. She also noticed the number of sponsorships in her community that were essentially in large part due to McDonald's owners. So, yeah, it's a really great book.
Do you all have personal relationships with McDonald's?
Oh, yes.
That leapt out, Jen.
Oh, yes.
We're listening.
I just remember, I mean, I don't know if this is a generational thing or just a thing with my mom, but
the Happy Meal?
The Happy Meal, I remember in Toronto where I grew up, she would take me, there was a McDonald's near our house, and she would take me there. I had a few birthday parties there. I mean, I have a very, very strong memories of McDonald's. And it's interesting now because actually we recently took a road trip this summer with my family, and we don't usually eat at McDonald's anymore. I think partly because it's like at this point I find it hard to digest. But we did stop at a few McDonald's, and my daughter really enjoyed it because for her it was a real treat. How about you, Parl?
A little bit, in the sense that I was a kid who worked in the mall for most of my adolescence. I would always eat lunch at McDonald's. But I think the deeper relationship is, I grew up for much of my life outside of America, and to have different relationships with the McDonald's in the Philippines, that was a really big. I still miss the Manila McDonald's,
Yeah.
and I miss the McDonald's in Delhi, and the sort of that kind of the way that every place I lived had their own spin on certain dishes.
Yeah.
And sometimes when I was homesick for American food, that's where I would go.
Like in China in the 90s, going out to McDonald's was that was a night out on the town. You would have huge family gatherings there. I don't know if it's still like
Not
that.
anymore. No.
Dwight, your feelings about fast food?
Well, I had a personal relationship yesterday with a Popeyes chicken sandwich.
Oh my God,
Also
Popeyes is
delicious.
so good. Popeyes is delicious.
Yes.
Spicy Popeyes got me through my third pregnancy.
I remember growing up in elementary school years in Naples, Florida, before it was a big town. We would get in the car and drive 45 minutes to Fort Myers, which was the closest large town, just to go eat McDonald's. This was a 45-minute drive both ways. And it was a big deal for us as kids.
All right. Well, this episode was brought to you by Wendy's. Dwight, Parl, Jen, you want to run down the titles first before we go? Parl?
I reviewed Serious Noticing by James Wood.
And I reviewed Franchise by Marcia Chatelaine.
Dwight?
I reviewed Cleanness by Garth Greenwell.
All right. Dwight, Jen, Parl, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.